So I wanted to welcome everyone to the annual Sukkot lecture by Rabbi Dr. Rosensweig, the Fifth Avenue Synagogue Scholar in Residence. We were hoping to meet in person in our new Sukkah on our new balcony, but unfortunately the weather did not cooperate. But the main thing is the Torah, and that will still take place. And this is a class, a lecture that's going on for many, many years. And it's a great honor to call upon Rabbi Rosensweig to share some words of Torah in honor of the holiday.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, just to begin, kind of begin on a down note, to express a little bit of disappointment. We were also looking forward to having this live, which we haven't had for a while, and to seeing the beautiful new venue for the Sukkah. But Od Chazon Lamoed, I'm sure we'll have opportunity in the future, so we look forward to that, as well as to the progress I understand that's being made in the shul's construction in general, which I'm hearing really very exciting things about. So even though we're disappointed to be on Zoom and not live, there's good reason for optimism going forward. I thought that maybe we would speak about one of the reasons that we're not all cramming into and making extraordinary efforts to be in the Sukkah venue this evening, even though it is Chag HaSukkos. But since the weather is not cooperating, so we switched to, and it's good that we have the option of Zoom. But the very notion that there's a mitzvah in the Torah, which is referred to several times, a mitzvah d'oraisa, a biblical mitzvah, and that somehow it can be canceled because of rain. That in itself, of course, is a phenomenon that is unparalleled pretty much in all of the halacha. You don't, rain doesn't usually constitute a p'tur, an exemption. Rain does not pikuach nefesh, typically. I mean, it can be, you can have terrible storms, but thankfully, we're not experiencing that, at least here on the East Coast. So, absent pikuach nefesh, why should weather conditions, play a role in the performance of a mitzvah? Especially when you consider the devotion that the Jewish people have to observing the halacha and, to taking, capitalizing fully on the opportunities of Avodas Hashem. We just, not so long ago, we celebrated the holiday of Yom Kippur. It sounds strange to say celebrates when you think about Yom Kippur. Most people have a certain dread of Yom Kippur, and the watchword of Yom Kippur is v'nisem es nafsho seichem, that we abstain from eating and from drinking, and therefore people find it to be a very difficult day. Physically, certainly, it is a very difficult and challenging day. However, I use the word celebrate advisedly because Yom Kippur is in the Parsha of the Moadim, and according to many Mefarshim, there's a concept of simcha, of joy on Yom Kippur. The Sefer HaChinuch speaks in these terms. Rabbi Yonasan, who wrote a commentary on the Rif, explains that the very fact that we say Zman, Shechayanu V'Kanu V'Giyanu, in the beginning of the prayers of Yom Kippur, that all these things point to the fact that there is joy on Yom Kippur. The Mishnah in Tainus and the Gemara speak about Yom Kippur as being a joyous day. One of the reasons Yom Kippur is a joyous day, despite being a challenging day physically, is because of the opportunity it provides for us to display our enthusiasm for Torah and mitzvot, for the spiritual opportunity to engage with and to develop a bond with Rabbanu Shalom. We see, the opportunity of Torah study and the performance of mitzvos and the observance of the festivals, etc. These are all, from our point of view, halachic gifts. They provide direction for us. They provide us the capacity to be able to do something that is indispensable, even as it looks philosophically unattainable, and that is to develop a relationship with the transcendent, creator, of the world, of the universe. God provided us with opportunities to bond with him, as difficult as that would philosophically, seem to be. And that's Torah mitzvos. And therefore, Yom Kippur, a day in which, the kesher, the bond between God and the children of Israel, is maybe the most intense Shabbos Shabboson as it is on any other day of the year. It requires of us that we, be so totally focused, that v'nisam es nafsho seichem, that we literally afflict ourselves, that we kind of ignore the things that typically sustain us, year in and year out, day in and day out, food and drink, and on another level culturally and in terms of parnasa, work. But we do that, with a sense of purpose and in some cases even joy, because the payoff and the symbolic implication of cementing the intensity of that relationship is so powerful that that it engenders joy. So given we're just coming off of Yom Kippur, we'll discuss this relationship more fully in a minute. Then all of a sudden, you're in a kind of spiritual high. We've, established our credentials, and we move on to the holiday of Sukkot. And then all of a sudden, a little bit of rain, and we're out of business. Where it's like, even, it takes less, to call, if you can use that phrase, a meal in the sukkah, than it does to call a major league baseball game. This is the season, I guess. If it was raining, drizzling to the point of, ruining one's soup, which is the shiur, we'll get to in a couple of minutes, of Geshem in the sukkah. I say they wouldn't delay the game, and they certainly wouldn't postpone the game, and not if it was a playoff game, not even if it was an exhibition game, probably. So why is it that in Sukkot, in the aftermath of Yom Kippur, it's so easy, to derail the mitzvah of Sukkah? On the one hand, mitzvah of Sukkah is perceived to be, a particularly, formidable opportunity. We'll get back to that in just a moment. There are all sorts of reports, of Tanoim and Amoraim, and then throughout our history, people have made tremendous, sacrifices in order to, eat in the Sukkah. Like Yerushalmi tells a story about somebody who was very far away from his home or from a sukkah, and just refused, eating, drinking. He was allowed to eat and drink under those conditions, but he kind of couldn't bring himself to do it. He was so emotionally, attached to the mitzvah of sukkah. And the Mishnah in sukkah itself discusses that there are certain, chachamim whose emotional, again, connection to the mitzvah of sukkah was such that they wouldn't take a drink of water, outside of the sukkah. So there are tremendous, indications that, we sacrifice a lot, and that the mitzvah of sukkah is very formidable, and a very critical mitzvah. It's part of, again, that halachic relationship, which we take very seriously and is very intense. So if that's the case, how can there be side by side with that, such a kula, such a leniency, where just like, a little bit of rain, tonight there's probably more than a little bit of rain from, what I'm hearing, on the window panes right outside of my house. But, even if it was, just, as I say, a more insignificant rainfall, the din is that Geshem is something that exempts from sitting in the sukkah. And more broadly than that, not only Geshem, not only rain, we'll discuss the differences a little bit in a couple of minutes, but there's a broader principle, and that is that mitzta'er is patur min sukkah. Mitzta'er means literally a person who's in distress, a person who's, experiencing, significant discomfort. The Rishonim point out that this discomfort also a very interesting phenomenon, has to have some sort of an objective basis to it. In other words, there's some kind of some amorphous discomfort per se, would not satisfy the requirement of mitzta'er, distress, being patur sukkah, being exempt from the sukkah. It has to be something that is, if it isn't exactly measurable, it's something that other people can identify with, and there might be a range. The Gemara says that there were people who are anine hadas, who are istinus, who had a particularly sensitive constitution, I guess you would say, and therefore respond to the difficulties in a more in a less flexible way. That too would constitute mitzvah and patur sukkah, but only if somebody really has that kind of makeup, emotional makeup, physical makeup. Meaning mitzvah doesn't apply to anybody who's uncomfortable for any reason, no matter what. There are certain principles, but having said that, the Gemara tells stories and about mitzvah mishum parushim, bugs, and odors in the sukkah. We'll get to in a couple of minutes. That things that are workable. You could definitely withstand the distress and the discomfort. And nonetheless, we have this rule that mitzvah, that somebody who is more than uncomfortable, but also not more than uncomfortable and much less than either ill or even in pain. Don't need to be at that level. You need to be in distress of some sort. Is patur sukkah. And the question is, not only in the aftermath of Yom Kippur, but just objectively speaking, why should that be true? In Kol Torah Kula, in other areas of halacha, when we have a biblical commandment, we do not encounter this kind of exemption, whatever it is. Again, the whole Yom Kippur, of course, is a bit mitzvah, obviously. We're told v'nisam is not shosechem. You could say that's the answer. That's what Yom Kippur, exactly, is. So of course there can be a poor mitzvah, tour of mitzvah. But the same is true for all mitzvahs. Many times in the context of performing a mitzvah, we encounter adverse circumstances, and there can be challenges emotionally and physically. And there's no universal rule that a mitzvah, that a person who is uncomfortable, is in distress, that he's exempt. So how and why should it be that on the one hand there's this tremendous mesiras nefesh, commitment, to sitting in the sukkah, and it's perceived as an appropriate bridge and continuity from Yom Kippur, if you will, on the one hand, and at the same time, side by side with that aspiration, which is very intense, you have these exemptions, which seem to reflect, like if it's not optimal conditions, somehow, we can opt out of the sukkah. So that's what I'd like to address a little bit, especially since we're on Zoom and not live, precisely as an expression of this idea, to try to examine a couple of perspectives on why that is so. Just to establish the facts to begin with. If you look here, I assume everybody has the Marmakomos. Marmakomos were sent out. Yeah. Okay, I'm getting nods from some of our regulars. So that's the people I look to in general. So we'll assume yes. So if you look on page, just one second, on page 3. So on page 3, the second entry is Talmud Babli Masechet Sukkah Daf Chaf Vav Omid Aleph. Yeah, okay. So the before we do that, the Actually, one second. I'm just trying to think if I put it here. Just give me 1 second. I'm trying to find it. No, I should have put it here. The Mishnah on Daf Chaf Hey Amud Beis, keep at Chaf Vav Amud Aleph, but I'm just going to read just for a minute the Mishnah on Chaf Hey Amud Beis. If you just give me 1 second. Like there's one advantage to being, on Zoom. So the Mishnah in Sukkot Daf Chaf Hey Amud Aleph says that shluchei mitzvah p'turim min sukkah, those individuals who are involved in some sort of a mission. Shluchei, I see Rabbi Roth is there, so it gives me an opportunity to greet him. I haven't seen him in a while, even on Zoom, so it's very nice to see him. Shluchei mitzvah p'turim min sukkah, cholin u'mishamsheim p'turim min sukkah, ochlin v'shosin arai chutz l'sukkah. So the Mishnah says that if somebody has to go on a mission of some sort to accomplish a mitzvah, that therefore he's traveling and he doesn't have the comforts of having his own sukkah readily available, so he's exempt from eating in the sukkah. But then the Mishnah says the same is true about cholin umisham shehem. If somebody's ill, so he is exempt from the sukkah, and not only is he ill, but misham shehem, his attendants, the people who help him, the aide, let's say, who is trying to look out for him to facilitate his recovery, to ease his situation, they're also exempt from the sukkah. And then the Mishnah concludes, you're allowed to eat and drink as long as you're not eating a significant meal, a kvius. You can eat and you can drink outside of the sukkah. So the Mishnah already establishes that if a person is ill, that not only he, but even the attendants, the aides who are not ill, are exempted from the sukkah.
Does that mean the aide, when they go home, they don't have to eat in the sukkah, or while they're in the house?
No. While they're attending, I mean, even in the context of attending or whatever they need to do in order to attend to the chola, at that point they're exempt from the sukkah. As you might have said, well, the chola, he's exempt from the sukkah, but the attendants, why should they be exempt from the sukkah? So what's particularly fascinating is if you look at the Gemara. So this is now go back to Chavav Amud Aleph, the second entry on page number 3, if everybody has that. So the Gemara speaks about this Mishnah, Cholin u'misham shehem, and they say Ton Rabbanan, Chola she'amru, the sick person that we're speaking about, Lo chola sheyesh bo sakana, as I pointed out before. We're not talking about somebody whose life is in jeopardy. It's not Pikuach Nefesh. Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbos and Docha Yom Kippur, practically, exempts one from anything in the halacha, with some very prominent exceptions, but they are exceptions. But we're not talking about a person whose illness jeopardizes his life. We're talking about somebody who, chol shesh basakana is typically understood, somebody who has, the kind of illness that disrupts his routine. And he has to lie down. He has to take a day off. He can't continue. He wouldn't continue working if he had that kind of. He has a bad virus. He has a bad, bacterial infection. He, something of that sort. He's ill. I mean, it's more than just, uncomfortable. We'll get to discomfort in a minute. But he's not, ill in any way that, that is dangerous. So that's what the Gemara says, Lo chola sheish basakana, afilu chola she'ein basakana, even if there's no danger whatsoever. Afilu chosh be'einav, let's say he has, his eyes are, but again, more than just, he has a little pain, probably he has an eye infection of some sort. Afilu chosh barosho, even then, he's exempt from the sukkah. Then the Gemara says, Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, pamachas chashti be'einai bekesari. I once had some, eye issues when I was in, Caesarea. The hitter Rabbi Yossi, Berebi Lishon Anim Shamshai Chutz Sukkah. He allowed me and my attendants to sleep outside of the sukkah. Then the Gemara says, Rav Shora l'Ravacha Bardala l'Migna Bekilsa b'Sukkah Mishum Baki. Baki is a kind of bugs of some sort. So Rav allowed Ravacha to sleep in the sukkah, but with like a netting or some sort of something over him so that he wasn't really in the sukkah, meaning it interfered with his being in the sukkah, because something to protect him from the infestation of the bugs in the sukkah. A Rava Shari, l'Ravachi Barada l'Migna Barmi B'Talasa, right? Rava allowed Rabbi Acha Barada to sleep outside of the sukkah, mishum sircha de gargishasa, because of some odor, that the dirt or whatever in the sukkah was making. And the Gemara says, Rabba l'tamei dama Rabba mitztayer patur min sukkah. If somebody's in distress, he's exempt from the sukkah. This is the Gemara that establishes. There's no Mishnah that says a mitztayer, that a person who is suffering or in distress or suffering severe discomfort is patur min sukkah. But this is the Gemara, and these are the examples that the Gemara gives. And the Gemara says, V'hanan tnan. Didn't we just say that chola misham shem patur min sukkah? Chola in mitztayer lo. There's a difference between somebody who is ill, even if his life is not in jeopardy, but it's still different if he's running a fever, if he's out of commission, than if he's simply annoyed by the bugs, or his constitution is such that he can't tolerate the smell. There's a difference between those two things. So which is it? Does he at least need to be a chola shem b'sakana, or do we require of him, or we don't even require that of him, and any mitzvah is patur min sukkah? So the Gemara says, no. Amri chola hu misham shav pturin, mitzvah hu patur misham shav lo. So the Gemara says there's a difference. If somebody is ill, I mean, he has a measurable illness of some sort, and something that, again, qualifies, him, to have that status. So not only is he exempt from the sukkah, but the aides, the attendants, they're also exempt from the sukkah. However, if a person is mitztayer, if he's in distress, he is exempt from sukkah. But the people who care for him, they're not exempt from the sukkah. So there are levels when it comes to this concept of mitztayer. But either way, what emerges is two chidushim. Number one, that a chola she'ein bo sakana, which typically does not exempt you from biblical obligations unless there's actual pikuach nefesh, unless there's actual, threat, to one's very existence. Typically, if a person, is ill, he's ill, and we make sure, for example, if a person is ill on Shabbos and it's in the category of chola she'ein bo sakana, so there's a heter, there's a, you're allowed to ask a non-Jew to do things on his behalf. Normally, you can't have a non-Jew, do malacha for you on Shabbos. That's called the prohibition of amira la'akum shvus. But amira la'akum shvus b'makom chola she'ein bo sakana, in a case where a person is ill, even though his life is not in danger, for chola she'ein bo sakana, we permit amira la'akum shvus, because that's a rabbinic prohibition, not a biblical prohibition. But the idea that a chola she'ein bo sakana would be exempt from, for example, he's not exempt from hearing the shofar. Right? He has to make sure to hear the shofar, right? And he's not exempt from eating matzah. So why is he exempt from sukkah? But then the Gemara is going further and saying that mitztayer, that a person who, is less than a chola she'ein bo sakana, which is why his attendants are not exempt, but he's also exempt. So discomfort or distress, is something that exempts you from a biblical commandment. That's a very shocking idea. So what I'd like to do is explore this idea a little bit more and to try to present basically three perspectives, which are also not mutually exclusive, meaning it could be that more than one of these ideas is true, and they certainly don't contradict each other. but I think three different aspects of the implications, we'll call it, of the exemption or the leniency of mitzvah. Okay, that's what I'd like to do. So the first one, I think, is really related to almost the yin and the yang, if you will, of Yom Kippur and the relationship between Sukkot and Yom Kippur. So I'd just like to frame it, in the following way. If you look at the Torah's presentation in Parshas Emor of Yom Kippur and of Sukkot, it's very striking that there's almost like a parallel, opposite presentation of these two holidays. I'll explain what I mean in just a minute. They share certain common features, the way that the Torah describes them or doesn't describe them, in such a way that, you have to juxtapose one with the other. You're kind of, encouraged, to be, comparing and contrasting them at the same time. So let me explain. So on page 1 of our Mar Makomos, I begin with Yom Kippur. Perek Chav Gimel is Parshas Emor. That's where the Torah presents all of the Moadim. So it starts Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Lemar, referring to Yom Kippur. Hashem tells Moshe the following, and then you have pasuk Chav Zayin. Excuse me. You have pasuk Chav Zayin, which says, "Ach, however, Ba'asar lachodesh hashvi hazeh, on the 10th day of this 7th month, Yom Kippurim hu, it's Yom Kippur, Mikra Kodesh Yelachem, B'Nisan Misnaf Shosechem, B'Kravtem Isha Lashem." So the first thing to notice is that the Torah begins discussing Yom Kippur with the word ach. And the word ach is a jarring term, and it's a negative term, and it's a it's a separating term. It's a way of saying there's something about Yom Kippur that is unique, that differs from the other holidays. Now, the Torah doesn't tell us what right away. Rashi says that, based on the Gemara in Masechet Shavuos, that it's a way of telling you, don't think Yom Kippur works without tshuva, right? Only with tshuva. It's actually a debate among the Tanaim. That's how Rashi, quoting the Gemara, explains the word ach. However, the Sforno and the Ibn Ezra, I think I have the Sforno here, if you can look on page, just one second. If you look on page 5, just go back, but keep page 1 in front of you. Keep 1 and 5 together. Ach ba'asar lachodesh hashvi'i. So the Sforno says, Afal pisha b'shar mikroi kodesh roi l'smoach u'lis'ane gam ba'chilo v'shtia. Even though a hallmark of every moed that we have in this parsha and the Moadim is the obligation to eat and to drink, meaning there is a feast, and celebration. Obviously, that's not what happens on Yom Kippur. And in that sense, it's ach, it's different. Kalmaro, normally we say, even on Rosh Hashanah, ichlu mashmanim shtu mamtakim shulchu manot le'ein nachon lo ki kadosh hayom la'adonenu, pasuk in Nehemiah, mikom makom basar lakodesh hu Yom Kippurim, on the day of Yom Kippur, the 10th day of Tishrei. That is a day lihisvados ulihis onein, to confess and to, kind of come to grips, ulis onein gever lachata'av, to come to grips with his culpability. Ve'ena yom simcha v'tanug, avalu yom inui ka'amaro. It's a day of affliction, right? Not a day of joy. I mentioned before that there are joyous aspects of Yom Kippur, but not in the hedonistic, not in the physical sense. So the word ach is basically telling you Yom Kippur stands out. It's different than all other holidays. But look now back on page 1, you'll see that Chag HaSukkos also has an ach. Now, the truth is there are 2 parshios, I've mentioned this in years past, because it's always relevant to understanding Sukkot. There are really two parshios of Sukkah in Parshas Emor. Parshas Emor begins with Shabbos, then goes Chag HaMatzos, Sfiras HaOmer, Chag HaShavuos, then Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. And after it finishes with Sukkot the first time, it has an additional parsha of Sukkah, starting with the word Ach. So, for example, if you look here, and again back to page 1, look at if you look at Pasuk Lamed Gimel, by Dabar Hashem Moshe Lemor, this is about Sukkot. Daber b'nei Yisrael Lemor b'chamisha asayom lachodesh hashvi hazeh, same words, lachodesh hashvi hazeh, the 7th month. Chag HaSukkot shivas yamim l'Hashem. But then, after the Torah finishes discussing it, and then they sum up, Pasuk Lamed Zayin, Elamod Hashem asher tikra sam mikroi kodesh la'akriv yishel Hashem olam minchal zavach u'nsachim dvar yom biyomo milvad shabsos Hashem milvad matnosechem milvad kol nidrechem u'milvad kol nidvosechem asher titnu l'Hashem. There's like a summary of all the different karbanos and moadim, etc. You think that's the end of the parsha, but it's not. Then you get Pasuk Lamed Tes, and you get 5 more psukim. Ach, b'chamisha asayom lachodesh hashvi ba'as v'chem esfuas haaretz tachogu es chag Hashem shivas yamim b'yom harishon mikra shabbason rather b'yom hashmini shabbason. V'lekachtem lachem b'yom rishon pri tzadar kapos tmorim anaf tzavos v'arvei nachal. You take the 4 minim, the lulav, the esrog, the hadassim, and the aravos. Usmachtem v'nei Hashem elokechem shivas yamim, and you are in a state of joy in the presence of the Ribono Shel Olam for 7 days. The Chagosamos Chag Hashem Shivas Yamim Bashana, etc. Basukos Teshvu Shivas Yamim. You are in the Sukkah for 7 days, and then finally you have Mem Gimel Leman Yedu Dorosechem, in order that the generation should know Ki Basukot Hoshavtis Bnei Yisrael B'Tziasam Eretz Mitzrayim Ani Hashem Elokechem. So I just want to break this down quickly, but clearly. So in the second parsha of Sukkot, right, again, the Torah uses the word ach. You can't read these 2 achs without, recognizing, the common, between them. They both start with ach. And again, if you look at the Sforno back on page, 5, the Sforno again comments, 1 second. Ach b'chamisha asayom, this is Pasuk Lamed Tes on page 5. Achar she'izkiras hadvarim haklalim shekol hamoadim maskimim bahem. Once the Torah has discussed all the common features that bind together all of the moadim, v'zeh b'mesha kula mikroi kodesh, they all use the term mikroi kodesh, u'tu'unim korban musaf, each one has special musaf karbanos, Kamaro elamod Hashem asher tikros mikroi kodesh like privishe, etc. Amar ach b'chamisha sayom lahodia shechag HaSukkos nivdal mishara moadim. It's different than all the moadim, just like Yom Kippur is different than all the moadim. Yom Kippur is different because of fasting and the solemn and somber, mood. What about Sukkot? The answer is Rishona Shashmini Shalom Mikra Kodiak, get an extra day. Instead of having 1 day, which you have in Yom Kippur, right, you have not only 7, but really 8. Kamaro, B'yom Hashmini Shabbason, Lo Chen B'mei HaShavua, B'mei Chag HaMatzos. You don't even have that in Pesach. The Chen B'chadashim, B'shanim, Shem, right? Kiddush Hashvi, Lo Hashmini. Shenis B'mesha Zeh HaChag Ton Shinui Dira. The fact that, like in no other holiday, do you change your headquarters, your living situation. Kamara b'seikos sukkos teshvu shlishis shaton lanua arba minim kamer lekach v'lechem b'yom harishon pri tzadar. Meaning, there are features of Sukkot that defy any other holiday, just as are features about Yom Kippur. But it's more than that. So if you look back at the Psukim on Yom Kippur, so the word Mikra Kodesh, I've mentioned this many, many times, but it's an important consideration. The word Mikra Kodesh is typically used in this parsha to signify the common feature of all the Moedim, which is that you're not allowed to do work on, of course, not on Shabbos, that's the paradigm. And what every Moed picks up from Shabbos is that you're not allowed to do work on Pesach, on Shavuos, on Sukkot, on Rosh Hashanah either. So when the Torah typically says Mikra Kodesh, it always says Kol Malachas Avodah Lo Sasu. When it comes to Yom Kippur, however, that's part of the Ach. The Torah says, "V'kol malacha lo sasu be'etzem hayom hazeh ki yom haKippurim hu l'chaper alechem lifnei Hashem Elokechem," meaning that you should not do malacha. We're expecting to read the words because it's Mikra Kodesh. Instead, we read the reason you can't do malacha is because it's Yom Kippur, not because it's generic. It shares in common, with the rest of the Moedim Mikra Kodesh, but like Shabbos, it's because it's Yom Kippur. Now, Sukkot, we do use the first time in Sukkot, the word Mikra Kodesh is connected to Isur Malacha. That's in Pasuk Lamed Hey. Bayom Arishon Mikra Kodesh Kol Malachas Avodah Lo Sasu. However, in the second parsha of Sukkot, the word Mikra Kodesh doesn't appear at all. So let me make it clear. When it comes to Yom Kippur, the Torah is very subtly telling us that Isur Malacha is an upfront primary theme of Yom Kippur. It's not a generic theme that it shares with all Yomim Tov. In other words, the Mikra Kodesh of Yom Kippur is different than all other Mikra Kodeshes. There is nothing generic about it. Yom Kippur is Kol Kulo, Miyuchat. It's just completely singular. When it comes to Sukkot, there are two different parshas. The first parsha says it's Mikra Kodesh, Kol Malachas Lo Sasu, like everything else. But the second parsha doesn't mention Mikra Kodesh at all. Also, like Yom Kippur, as if to say there's an aspect of Sukkot which is completely unique. Instead, what is the term that the Torah uses? Shabbason. Right, in the whole second parsha. B'yom HaRishon Shabbaton, B'yom HaShmini Shabbaton. Right? Which, of course, the phrase that sometimes is mentioned in Yom Tovim, but it's the only parsha where there's no Mikra Kodesh at all. Next, if you look at Yom Kippur, two things stand out. One, that Yom Kippur is a holiday that is considered to be a manifestation of Lifnei Hashem Elokechem. It's like you're standing in the presence of God. That's a phrase that the Torah uses regarding Yom Kippur. Look here at Pasuk Chavches. V'kol malacha lo sasu be'etzem hayom hazeh ki yom kippurim hu l'chaper alechem lifnei Hashem Elokechem. In the presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom. It's a very rare phrase. And it's a phrase that is used regarding Yom Kippur. The same phrase is used in Parshas Achrei Mos towards the very end of the description of the Avodas Yom Kippurim. Again, Ki bayom hazeh chaper alechem l'chaper Ki yom hazeh chaper alechem v'tareschem mikol chatosechem lifnei Hashem titaru. But the Torah uses the same expression in the second parsha of Sukkot. What does it say? Pasuk Mem. Ulakachtem b'chem b'yom harishon priyei tzadar kapos smarim anafei tzavos arvei nachal usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem shivas yom. In the presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom, same words, but here it's Simcha, there it was V'Nisan, for 7 days. When it comes to Yom Kippur, it's very rare in the Parsha, but the Torah gives an explanation of why it is that we do what we do on Yom Kippur. Right? Pasuk Chavches. V'kol malacha lo tasu b'etzem hayom hazeh ki yom kippurim hu l'chaper alechem lifnei Hashem Elokechem. Ki yom kippurim hu is an explanation that we don't find in any of the other Moadim. except of course the second parsha and Sukkah. Look at Pasuk Mem Gimel. Leman yedu dorosechem. This is also an explanation why we're having the holiday of Sukkot. Ki b'Sukkos hashaftis b'nei Yisrael b'hotzio osam me'eretz Mitzrayim ani Hashem Elokeichem. So what I'm trying to show very briefly, and there are more, I think I've shown already 5, that's probably enough for our purposes, that there are at least 5 different, subtle but clear manifestations of the uniqueness of Yom Kippur in its presentation, and they are matched by a parallel 5, pretty much, manifestations of the way that the Torah uniquely presents Sukkot in its second parsha, the very fact that there is a second parsha, of course. What is the significance of this? Why does the Torah want us somehow to be reading Yom Kippur, and Sukkot together? But I think the answer is really simple, profound but simple. 2 things. Number one, of course, Sukkot follows Yom Kippur. And the Ramban in his commentary, asks the question. The Tur, in his monumental work, made this question more famous. I guess more people read the Tur than the Ramban al Torah at a certain point, so he got credit for this question. And that is the question of why do we celebrate Sukkot, at this time of year, right? We should be celebrating it right after Yetzias Mitzrayim, because it's Leman yedu dorosechem ki b'Sukkos hoshafti es b'nei Yisrael b'hotzio osam me'eretz Mitzrayim. Various answers have been given to this question. The Ramban, and then later the Tur, who got credit for it, suggests that maybe the reason is because if we had celebrated Sukkot in the spring, people would say the weather is terrific. Maybe we're sitting out in the sukkah because it's it's a very enjoyable, stylish thing to do. But when the weather is more problematic, so it's clear that there's a mitzvah purpose. That's a very popular answer that the Tur gives, that the Ramban had suggested as well. But another answer that's given by the Mefarshim, the Tzror Hamor, one of the Rishonim and many Achronim, is that Sukkot had to be in Tishrei. And the Ramban hints at it when he says, Ramban notes that all of the festivals of Tishrei use the expression, Zos, right? When it's, if you look at Ach Basar L'Chodesh HaShvi, Hazeh Yom Kippurimu, Pasuk Chav Zayin. And then again, when the Torah speaks about Sukkot, the first time in this case, Daber b'nei Yisrael imor b'chamisha asar yom l'chodesh hashvi hazeh. So the Ramban says, the reason it says hazeh 2 times is to show you that the holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, that appear in Tishrei, it's not a coincidence. There is continuity between them. Although the Ramban doesn't explain what the continuity between Yom Kippur and Sukkot is, he does, of course, explain Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The Tzror Hamor, however, says that, and many Achronim have, their own ways of saying this, that in a very real sense, Sukkos is the aftermath of Yom Kippur. But I would like to suggest, just to say it a little bit differently, and that is, there couldn't be a Yom Kippur without the follow-up of Sukkos, and there couldn't be a Sukkos without the antecedent, the earlier experience of Yom Kippur. And in a very real sense, and this is what I think the Psukim are hinting at, when they, number one, present both Yom Kippur and Sukkot, as being, very singular relative to the other Chagim, and in ways that are opposite in some senses and parallel in others of each other. What we're really saying is that even though Yom Kippur and Sukkot appear to be opposite, one an expression of yira and pachad, fear and trembling, fear for our lives, awe in the presence of the Ribono Shel Olam. Sukkot seems to be a time joy, of happiness, of Ivdu as Hashem b'simcha. And that is true. Typically, in most cultures, the fear and the joy are incompatible with each other. But in the world of Torah, there are really two sides of the same kind. Each one is a critical component in our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There can be no such relationship without a sense of awe and even fear, in the sense of accountability for our conduct and behavior, and trying to measure up, and the awe that inspires, to being avadim lamakom. And at the same time, of course, the idea of celebrating that, and perceiving, that developing that bond and finding a purpose in life, is the supreme opportunity and a source of joy, is critical as well. It's like we say in, the Koheles that we'll be reading, there's a time for joy, there's a time for fear. In Judaism, these are not contradictory. There's a time to manifest each of them. And in some respects, one leads and deepens the other. And the holidays, the festivals, accentuate these different motifs and their interrelationship. So, for example, Yom Kippur, again, is V'ni Semes Nafshosechem. It's a day of Inui Nefesh. And when it comes to Sukkot, of course, we have three expressions of Simcha, right? The Torah here in Parshas Emor, Usmachtem Lefnei Hashem Elokechem Shivas Yamim. And if you look in Parshas Re'eh, also on page 1, look at Pasuk Perek Tezayin and Devarim, Pasuk Yud Daled and Tesvav, you'll find V'samachta b'chagecha tov v'incho v'techa abcha masa v'alevi v'ger v'yasam v'almona asher b'sharecha v'samachta b'chagecha. That's a reference to the holiday of Sukkot. And then you have Shivas Yamim tachog l'Hashem Elokecha b'makom asher yivchar Hashem kivarecha Hashem Elokecha b'chol tvuascha b'chol masi yadecha v'hayisa ach sameach. All combined between Emor and Re'eh, we have three Simcha references to Sukkot. We have no references of Simcha on Pesach, and we have one in Parshas Re'eh with regard to Shavuos. Clearly, the Torah accentuates extreme Simcha only with regard to the holiday of Sukkot. And this is what the Rambam himself says. If you look at the very next entry in Hilchos Shofar V'Sukkah V'Lulav Perek Ches Halacha Yud Beis, the Ramam says, even though in all Moadim there's an obligation to express joy, when it came to the Beis HaMikdash, on Chag HaSukkos there was excessive joy, additional joy. Shenemar, according to the Pasuk in Emor, Usmachtem Fnei Hashem Elokechem Shivas Yamim. And then the Rambam goes on to describe what we call Simchas Beis HaShoeva. They used to have, a musical, festival, every night of Chol HaMoed, with singing and instruments, and I'm sure they had chazanos there, as well, and dancing, and that's what the Rambam goes on to describe. And then the Ramam concludes in Halacha Yudalid, which goes into the next page. In Halacha Tezvav, Hasimcha sheyismach ha'adam b'asiyas ha'mitzvah u'ba'avas hakel shetziva behen avoda gedolahi. That the Ramam speaks in general about the principle of Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha. This, of course, is sharp contrast, but it's not really a contrast. It's more a complement to Yom Kippur. What does the Ramam say about Yom Kippur? The Ramam says you do not say Hallel on Yom Kippur. And the reason that you do not, this is the Rambam, let me find it for a second. 1 second. Yeah. The Rambam says you do not say Hallel on Yom Kippur because, and do not say it on Rosh Hashanah as well. And the reason for that is because Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are not Yemei Simcha Yisera. They are days of Pachad. They are days of Ema. Where is this Rambam? The Rambam is to be found. I'm pretty sure I put it here, so just give me 1 second. It's the Rambam in Hilchos Chanukah. If anybody finds it before me. 1 second. I thought I put it here. Okay, maybe I didn't put it here. The Ramam in Hilchos Chanukah explains that we don't say Hallel in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because they are Yemei Yira v'Fachad, Be'ein Bahem Simcha Yisera. So Chag HaSukkos in the Mikdash was a time of Simcha Yisera, and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is a time when it's Ein Bahem Simcha Yisera. Again, the Rambam writes these in different places, but if you put them side by side, which I thought I did on this sheet, the message is clear. So is it surprising that you go from an expression like but we'll call it not a begrudging, but enthusiastic v'nisem esnaf shosechem on Yom Kippur, the day of Yom Kippur, and then you have, if you've done that properly and you've achieved that goal, so then you're ready for the transition of Simcha, and the Simcha, which doesn't even tolerate anything close to V'inisem, but which establishes on a biblical level that even Mitzdayer, never mind Chol Hashem Bo Sakana, is Patur Min Simcha, Min Sukkah. Sorry. The again, it's worth noting that the Ramban in his Perush Ala Torah, when he wants to explain, seemingly wants to explain why we have these leniencies, says the Torah speaks about Kol HaEzrach, an Ezrach sits in the sukkah, and the Ramban says Ezrach Ra'anen, somebody who is in a state of joy, somebody who's in a state of exuberance. So the first perspective is that Yom Kippur transitions into Sukkot. It's mentioned this in the past also, but it's a very fascinating thing. The last halacha in Hilchos Yom Kippurim is the suggestion that the Shulchan Aruch makes, based on the Maril, I believe, that a person should start constructing their sukkah immediately after Yom Kippur. When Yom Kippur is over, after you eat a little bit, if it's possible, you start building the sukkah. In the very next halacha begins Hilchos Sukkah, and the first halacha of Hilchos Sukkah is again that after you break your fast on the night of Yom Kippur, it would be terrific if you begin to build the sukkah already that night. It sounds like a repeat of the same halacha. The Mefarshim actually work hard to try to explain that maybe something different is referred to in each of these halachot, and it's very possible that there is actually a substantive difference between the two halachot. But of course, even if that is true, what's surprising is that the Shulchan Aruch didn't just bundle them either in the beginning of Hilchos Sukkah or in the end of Hilchos Yom Kippurim. Because even if there's a difference in terms of what we're referring to, obviously the broader theme is common. It's an identical idea. But I always thought, whether intentional or we could say it providential, that the presentation of the Shulchan Aruch is actually really perfect. And that what we're really being told is that there are two different aspects to the same halacha. You should build the sukkah right after Yom Kippur, even that night. You need to do that from the perspective of Yom Kippur, and then you also need to do that from the perspective of Sukkot. Sukkot requires the background of Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur needs the follow-up of Sukkot. Either alone is an extreme, and therefore an eviscerated Judaism. But the idea that Yom Kippur, paves the way for, but also is the background of the Simcha of Sukkot, that is truly representative of the complexity, the hekef, the wide range and scope, and everything that follows, the implications thereof, of having, a religion and having a religious code, the halacha, which addresses really all dimensions of human emotions, and which kind of regulates, when to apply, when to emphasize each of these, at a proper time, and in a proper way. So from that point of view, the chidush of chola she'ein bo sakana, hu umisham shav, he and his attendees being patur, and the extension even further to mitzvah, patur, menasukkah, is really very understandable. So that's the first perspective. It's the idea that mitzvah, patur, menasukkah is an extreme application of a singular emphasis on Simchas Yom Tov in the Sukkah. And I think it's reflected in Torah Shebitzav, in the halacha, and even in the structural presentations of different codes, and of course implied in various.
But if it's Simchas Yom Tov, then why wouldn't it be personal? I mean, I understand like an istiness, but let's say some guy goes to football games, like you said, or baseball games. He watches the Jets lose in the rain. So why can't he sit in the sukkah in the rain? He enjoys it. He likes the rain. He lives in Seattle.
If somebody likes the rain, so let's talk about the rain just for a minute. I think I once did speak about the relationship between rain and mitzvah, and tonight is a rain night, so I'll just say something very brief about it.
We were rained out.
We are rained out, and I did give the baseball mashal before, so let me just talk about it.
Yankees are playing.
What's that?
The Yankees are not rained out.
They're not.
No. Not
and
that
they're
I'm
playing
aware.
Tonight.
I didn't check since we were learning, but I doubt it.
Right. So
but
we don't even know
wrong.
that they exist while we're learning, even though we wish them well. But that's a great example. Okay. So yeah. So the question of you're asking a very, very important question. So let me just say two things about it. Number one, when I mentioned before about whether mitzvah is objective or subjective, so let me clarify what I mean by that. The answer is that it's a little bit of both. You can't have a situation, and let's talk about it in two extremes. Again, you're such a gung-ho, enthusiastic mitzvah doer, apparently, that you're worried about somebody who can tolerate the mitzvah, and if he can tolerate the mitzvah and he would stay in the baseball game, then let him stay in the sukkah as well. I was speaking about it from the other point of view, but let me speak about it both. Namely, let's say you have somebody who's an istinus, somebody who's very sensitive in terms of his, the personal conditions, that he can tolerate. And therefore, even though a typical person wouldn't be driven, from a venue by certain odor or, a little bit of buzzing of, bugs or as the case may be, but he's just far more sensitive. So what I was trying to point out is that if you look carefully, again, it's getting a little late, so I don't think I'll read this inside, but in the Marmakomos I have it as well. The Ramah quotes it. It's a view of the Uraim and Mordechai. They both say that, if a person just says, I can't tolerate it, but there's no objective category. Like, istiness is something that we know about. We know some people really do have certain sensitivities, sensations and to noise and, to annoyances. This is a known psychological condition. It may not be something that you can quantitatively, define so easily, but these are known conditions. What the halacha requires that this shouldn't be completely subjective as a kula, meaning it should be something that we recognize on some level. We recognize the subjectivity, but within that, we also recognize it as a category, as opposed to a person all of a sudden kind of, without precedent or any kind of parallel, kind of expressing just a personal it shouldn't be distaste and it shouldn't be annoyance. It should be something that attains a certain objective, level. That's number one. But you're asking a very interesting question in the opposite direction. You're saying, let's say a person is feeling, distress, uncomfortable, and let's say it qualifies on any level, for mitzvah being patur min hasukah, but he is such a impassioned, fan of the sukkah, he can't imagine eating outside the sukkah, and therefore, he refuses, to give in, to the discomfort. So is that a problem or not? So here there might be a distinction between geshem and mitzvah. Many of the poskim equate them. They assume that mitzvah and geshem are just, one is a more extreme example of the other. I'm not going to document this now because it would take too long. But if you look in, many of the poskim in Shulchan Aruch, there are two simanim in Shulchan Aruch, Taf Reish Lamed Tes and Taf Reish Mem. And earlier in the Rishonim, if you look at the Chuvas HaRashba, when he talks about the Rashba discusses a question that the Bali Tosas discussed, and that is, let's say it rains, or if the conditions in the sukkah are very detrimental on the first night of Sukkot. So on the first night of Sukkot, there's a greater urgency to eat in the sukkah. The Gemara explains that, the parallel to Chag HaMatzos, Tesvav, each one is on the 15th day. Just like you have to eat the kazayas of matzah, the Seder, you really almost have to eat a kazayas in the sukkah.
But if it rains all night, you don't have to eat. You just have to wait for the rain to stop longer, right?
So that's the question. If it rains, or if it's, so there are three views in the Rishonim. One view in the Rishonim says, if it's raining or mitzvah, you're exempt on the first night as well. The other view, Bali Tosas and Masachet Brachos say, even if it's pouring, never mind the bugs are, particularly, annoying, you are obligated to actually sit in the sukkah and eat your kazayas, even in the, even in the context of that barrage. And then you have a group of Rishonim, which is the more popular view in the poskim, which is that, you can't make the bracha, if it's raining, certainly. You also can't just, apply the exemption because of tesvav, and therefore you have to wait until the rain stops, and you might have to wait for a very long time until the rain stops, and that's usually what most of us do. However, it could very well be that you could also distinguish between rain and mitzvah. And this goes to the question that you're asking in a way. It could be I'll just give you a little bit of evidence. The Mishnah in Masachet Sukkah speaks about chola shebo sakana on daf Chaf Hey Amud Aleph, as I mentioned. It speaks about geshem, a couple of dapim later. It separates them. The Rambam in Perek Vav of Hilchos Sukkah, let's see if we can find that for a moment. 1 second. I'm guessing. 1 second. Let's look on page 3. The Rambam speaks about rain separately from his treatment of mitzvah. In Perek Vav Halacha Beis, look on page 3. You'll see it says Ramam Hilchos Shofar v'Sukkah v'Lulav Perek Vav Halacha Beis. Ram says Cholim u'Mishamsheim Pturim min HaSukkah. Cholim and their attendants are exempt from the sukkah. And then Cholo Sheish Basakana Afilu Chash Barosha Afilu Chash Be'einav. And then he says Mitzvah Patur min HaSukkah. Right? If a person is uncomfortable, he's distressed, he's patur min HaSukkah. V'lo Mishamshav. Ezu Mitzvah Zesheni Yachal Lishon b'Sukkah. A person who can't sleep in the sukkah, Pnei Ruach, the wind, Pnei Zvuvim, bugs, Parushim, Kiyotza, Pnei Reach, etc. Then look at the Rambam in Perek Vav Halacha Yud. And this is very faithful to the Gemara. The Gemara says, the Rambam says, Yordu Geshamim, if it rains, Hareza nichnas l'toch habayis. Notice that there are 8 halachos separating the Ramam's treatment of mitzdayer and his treatment of geshem, right? But more than that, when the Ramam tells you that you're mitzdayer, what does he say? Mitzdayer patur min sukkah. If you're uncomfortable, you're exempt from the sukkah. What does he tell you about geshem, that you're exempt? No, he just says emphatically, as if there's not even a question. Exempt means that if you choose, right, to tolerate the discomfort or the distress, or if you're not personally distressed, then you can probably make the bracha. Correct? Which is what you're asking me about.
You could.
Like you would stay for the football game, then you would stay for the. Then you could be able to stay for the sukkah.
The game is canceled till tomorrow. Just anyone misquoted.
What's that?
The game is also canceled because of the shiur. The game was postponed. I don't want to be
because of
the shiur. No, I want to make sure nobody was mevatel.
100%. Good for them. By the way, it'll be a skula for them.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean,
Yardu geshamim hareza nichnas l'toch habayis. It doesn't say that he's patur. What does it say? He should go home, go inside. And what else does it say? Me'emasai mutar lefanos. This is all based on the Gemaras. When are you allowed to? What does lefanos mean when it comes to geshem? What does the word lefanos means? Means to go inside, of course, but it means more than that. To evacuate, right? Pinui, right, means it's like an evacuation. The Hagos Ashri actually says that you should evacuate the kalim. You should start taking in the the nice dishes. It's like you're dismantling part of your sukkah. You don't have that in mitzdayer. Mishiyerdu sukkos tipos shem yapilu betoch hatavshil yifsad apilu tavshil shapul. There's a shiur when it comes to geshem. If it's again not enough to cancel the baseball game if it wasn't also for the shiur, right? Just a few drops inside that ruin your soup. I guess they'd ruin the beer in the baseball game, right? So, but there's no shiur of mitzdayer. And then we're told a very big chiddush. This is not just the Ramam. This is the Gemara. The Ramam's copying it faithfully. The Ramam says it's based on the Gemara. If you start eating in the sukkah,
what was this thing I made?
And then all of a sudden it starts raining, and you go inside. Let's say it stops raining in the middle of the meal. Let's say it stops raining in the middle of the meal. So the Ramam says you don't have to come back out. Let's say you're sleeping in the sukkah, and all of a sudden it starts raining. So you come inside. You're not obligated that night to return to the sukkah. You don't have to check every hour to make sure maybe the rain stopped.
So right? when he goes into the house, does he say Rahman sukkahs dovis and oferes?
That's just
I think he still could. It's still the holiday of Sukkot.
Why not?
But anyways, but the point is, do you have that in mitzdayer? Let's say you're mitzdayer. Let's say there are bugs in your sukkah. And let's say you go inside. And, there's always one person in the family, who's more enthusiastic than others. So they go out to check. The bugs are gone, and you're in the next part of the meal.
That's what money's for.
Is this somebody? I guess can't hear. Somebody trying to ask a question, or is this?
Alan, you're not on mute. Alan, go on mute. People don't realize you're not on mute.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So
I'll text them.
Yeah. So let's say you're mitzdayer, and then you start eating, and you're in the second course. Are you and then somebody checks and says the conditions of
Debbie and Rabbi Roth, you're not on mute either.
Okay.
What happened?
Rabbi Rosensweig is on mute.
You see, he went on mute. He was so careful.
No, I did not go on mute. Somebody muted me, but that's okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you now.
Yeah, no, I obviously somebody pushed the wrong button, but it wasn't me.
Okay.
Maybe I should have muted myself, but
No, chas v'shalom.
so basically the idea is as follows. Geshem, according to the Vilna Gaon, is something which jeopardizes the definition of the sukkah. When it's raining, it's not a functioning sukkah. And therefore to continue is meaningless. You begin to even evacuate some of the things in the sukkah, because it's not really a sukkah at this point. For you to make a bracha would be a bracha levatala. And by the same token, there is a certain time you have like a grace period, if you will. You know, if you started your meal, or when you started your meal, it was raining in the sukkah, there was no sukkah alternative. As far as this meal is concerned, right? You're not bypassing the sukkah, right? The sukkah bypassed you. There was no sukkah. There's no viable sukkah. However, mitzdayer is a ptur. It's an exemption. So number one, it's much more subjective. There's no shiur. Number two, that's what the Ramam says. It's a ptur. If you choose to remain, the sukkah's fine, right? Moreover, if the conditions of mitzvah dissipate and you can now return, then the exemption is no longer justified. So again, let me make it clear. This is my understanding of the Rambam. To me, this is a very compelling comprehension of this difference. I do have to tell you that many poskim assumed that it's all the same, and that whatever applies to one applies to the other. But in my opinion, the Rambam and the way that he presents it, and even in the Gemara and Mishnayos, it sounds like they're very different. So, Jacob, the answer to your question is, if a person, according to this perspective, if a person, was subjectively inclined l'chumra, and this often happens, most people, are not looking to, the sukkah is a very beloved, institution. I mentioned before that, the Yerushalmi talks about cases of people who, walked a million miles, for the sukkah. They didn't have to. And the Mishnayos already speak about the Chachamim who refused to drink a cup of water outside of the sukkah. They didn't have to either. There's a certain deep affection. Klal Yisrael understands that the holiday of Sukkot, what it represents, underscoring our dependence on the Ribono Shel Olam and our faith in Him. You leave your permanent homes. You go into this much more flimsy hut, which is subjected to things like rain and bugs and so on. We all understand that, in the aftermath of Yom Kippur in particular, the joy of, the Daled Minim and the joy of the Sukkah, the triple Usmachtem is really inspiring. And therefore what you find in Sukkot is really a fascinating phenomenon. You find the greatest leniencies and the greatest stringencies side by side. On the one hand, mitzvah patur and geshem maybe is not even considered a sukkah, meaning the conditions that warrant sukkah have a high standard. And at the same time, the commitment that Klal Yisrael has always shown to fulfilling this mitzvah is because there's a recognition that this is an expression of joy and of faith. And, this is a progression, from Yom Kippur, which defines the path of, Yira to Simcha, which defines, the range and the life and the meaning, of life, for each and every Jew. So that's one aspect of Mitzvah Patim Sukkah. Let me just mention two others very briefly. The Balei Tosas explained that mitzvah is patur min sukkah because of the principle of teishvu ke'ein taduru. This can be found in your Marmakomos on page 3. It's the second entry from the bottom. Hoche drachem bayom. Koza nafka miteshvu kein taduru, says Tosas. The exemptions, a person who has to go for business or shluchei mitzvah, he has to go on a mitzvah mission, all these exemptions, you're not exempt from matzah and you're not exempt from shofar. Why from sukkah? Tosas says, because the Torah says, but sukkah's teshvu ke'ein taduru. In other words, we'll explain this in just a minute, that the pattern of is mandated in the sukkah is determined by the way that you live your life in your home. If you go on business trips or mitzvah missions, then you can do that on sukkahs and leave your sukkah for that as well. Then Tosas goes on to say, "V'chein mitztar depatur le'elmin hasukkah haina miteshvu kein taduru. De'ein adam dar b'makom shemitztar." This is true not only about business and holy missions, etc. It's also the basis for this unusual, right, incomparable halacha that mitzta'er is patur min hasukkah, because if a person lives in a home, right, he's not going to remain in that home for long. If it's infested by bugs, or if it's there are other aspects of living there that are intolerable to him, or that are create discomfort or distress. He'll find an alternative. So the sukkah has to be a place whose comforts, let's say, parallel the home. Now the question is, what does that mean? So 2 points very quickly, because we want to get to the end. Number one, the implication, and then the practical or halachic implication, and then the philosophical implication. The practical implication is that mitzta'er is really defined. We now have a measure for mitzta'er. If mitzta'er is the way the Ramban understood it, and what we're talking about till now, an expression of simchas yom tov and so on. So, it's harder to define it, to measure it. Even then, we said it has to be, can't just be what a person claims. There has to be some category that it corresponds to. We're talking about people who are hypersensitive, in their capacity to tolerate things. That these are known categories, even if they're hard to define. But according to the second perspective, we now have a better gauge, a better litmus test. The litmus test is, if you were sitting in your living room, what would you do? If you were sitting in your living room and there was an odor, if you were sitting in your living room, there were bees or bugs, that were oppressing you, would you leave? Would you go to a different room? Would you go to a different house? Would you check into a hotel? In addition, there has to be benefit, from the change in venue. So what's fascinating is, I'm just going to discuss this Gemara for a minute. If you look here on page 3, the third entry, the Gemara speaks about an avel, a person who, a mourner, person who suffered a loss, family member. So the Gemara says the following: Kufa, Amar Abba Bar Zabda Marav. You know what? I'm going to skip a little bit because it's a little late. Let's go. Don't start from the first line. Skip to the third line. Okay. The Gemara says, Amar Abba Bar Zabda Marav Avel Chai B'Sukkah. That's at the end of the line. Everybody have that? A mourner is obligated to eat in the sukkah. The Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Says the Gemara, Ma'u d'sema hol v'Amar Abba Bar Zabda Marav mitztar patur min hasukkah, hainami mitztarhu. Because you might have thought that if a person is an avel, right, then he is in a state of distress, and therefore he should be exempt from the sukkah. Kamashmalan. Therefore, the Gemara is telling you that it isn't the case. What isn't the case? That's the question we'll get to. Hani mili tsar de mimela. If we're talking about, tsar, that, is based on what? What's tsar de mimela mean? The environment of the sukkah? Is this about the environment of the sukkah as opposed to personal distress? Right? if a person's of the atmosphere in the sukkah could be perfect. He's in an existential crisis because he's an Avel. So is that what we're saying? Sarah de Mimela, meaning the environment as opposed to the individual? Is that it? Hard to say. We'll see in a moment. Aval hacha ihu hudekamet stara nafshe. He is in distress. He's obligated to overcome his feelings. So there are different ways to explain what this means. So one way, the way that you would explain it according to the Balitosis, let me say it this way. One way to explain it is what we hinted at before. Mitzdayer maybe is potter when the environment is compromised, not when the individual is distressed. On the other hand, if you had said our first perspective, the Ramban, as Rach Ra'anan, you have to be able to achieve a certain level of simcha in the sukkah, right? Then it has nothing to do with the environment. It has to do with the individual and his experience. However, if this is about Teshvu Ke'in Taduru, there can be a third explanation. What did Bali Tosa say? Teshvu Ke'in Taduru, meaning you'd go to a different room if you were in your house, or you'd go to a different house, if this happened, where you live, and it was unacceptable to you. Meaning there has to be a benefit to going inside. So if he's an Avel and he's distressed, and his distress stems from his own, challenging, psychological circumstances, is it going to help him if he goes inside the house? Is that what the Gemara is saying? So here the Rush, we're a little late, so I'm going to, Makoros are here on the page, you can look at them later, but I'm just going to speak about them a little instead of reading them. So the Rush says the following, a very fascinating insight. The Rush says, when a person is an Avel, when he's mourning, he psychologically would prefer to be alone. He doesn't want to be in the sukkah, in the social environment of the sukkah. Yes, he would, in some respects, he would benefit from being, in the house if everybody else was out in the sukkah. That is what the Rosh says. And then what the Gemara is saying is, even though that's true, you should try to overcome that. Maybe because it's Yom Tov or it's Chol HaMoed, and therefore, he may be experiencing the feelings of Avelos, but he's also obligated to try to override them.
There is no Avelus on Yom Tov anyhow.
Right. I mean, there is Nichum Avelim on Chol HaMoed.
Chol HaMoed, yeah.
But
Avelus, yeah.
Right, the actual Avelus. So maybe that's what the Gemara is Yisuvei Daite. But there's a very long Taz. I'll tell you what Taz's view on the bigger question is in just a moment. The Taz strongly attacks the Rush. He says, what do you mean? This is just a very interesting little subplot. What do you mean that a mourner, the Rush says that what? In order to explain this Gemara, the Rush posits that a mourner would prefer isolation rather than the company, rather than the social environment of the sukkah. So the Taz says, if that were true, what would be the purpose of Nichum Avelim?
Yeah, that's it.
But I think it's a fascinating question. See, that's why he rejects the Rush. But I think that just to weigh in on this question for a moment, it's not a sukkah question, but I think what the Rush says is totally true, notwithstanding the question of the Taz. Meaning the halacha thinks that it is constructive for a mourner to be with people, that this is part of the process, that allows him to outlet and manifest his grief on the one hand, and to reconnect slowly, with the rest of the world, which ultimately he needs to rejoin. And therefore it is constructive for him to be comforted by others. But psychologically, it doesn't mean that that's what he personally would prefer. He might be mitzdayer, even though it's a tikkun for him. It's more complicated than that. But anyways, that's the discussion of the. But the point is, if you take the second perspective, that Teshvu Ke'im Taduru is always measured by the alternative, namely, it's bad here and it's better elsewhere, then it really does have to be better elsewhere. And that depends on the various interpretations of this line in the Gemara about Avel. Is Avel mitzvah or not? There are some poskim in Shulchan Aruch who say, you know what, when the Gemara says, Ibo Yisuve Daite, the Gemara means he should try to get over it and put himself in a better state of mind. But if he lost a really close, family member, and he's incapable of doing that, some poskim say this in Shulchan Aruch, he really would be patur min hasukah. Some say if it's a husband and a wife, or somebody who he's just inconsolable, he just can't overcome it, he really would be patur min hasukah. That's an interesting debate. In any case, this whole second perspective is all about, let me talk about the hashkafic significance of it. The first perspective was that mitzvah is exempt because we have very high standards of simchas Yom Tov and simchas Sukkos, and therefore somebody, who's hypersensitive or somebody who's, not able, right, to, for objective reasons, to attain a certain, level of joy on, a certain feeling on Sukkot, that kind of defeats the purpose of the sukkah itself. That's the first perspective. The second perspective is equally very important. It basically says that sukkah is not just a mitzvah that we perform on this holiday. You pick up a lulav, you sit in the sukkah, you hear the shofar. It really is about a change in headquarters. It's really about immersing yourself so much in the experience that it is gauged by how you perceive your home life. Meaning the standard of Teshvu Ke'ein Taduru applied to a mitzvah that applies for 7 days in the year is really a very remarkable demand. But it's one which highlights that the transition from Yom Kippur to Sukkot isn't only about simcha. It's also about appreciating and upgrading, uplifting, your life all year round, your regular life, your home life, your family life. So you go out for 7 days, you kind of copy the dimensions of the Beis HaMikdash, you accentuate your dependence upon the Ribono Shel Olam, but all the while you're preparing, to kind of, recommit, to bringing those values back home. And therefore, this temporary abode of the sukkah, right, there can be tremendous leniencies, but they really flow from the tremendous ambition and aspiration, to infuse, home life, with the standards of sukkah, and therefore a sukkah which is defined appropriately by the parallel, to home life. And that's a very extraordinary thing. There's a third perspective as well, and with this one I'll conclude. I mentioned the Taz. The Taz doesn't like the view of the Rosh. The Taz was very troubled by the Gemara. What is the Gemara talking about? When it debates whether or not an Avel, mourner, is a mitzvah or not. After all, he would be, existentially distressed in the sukkah. He'd be, according to the Taz, equally existentially distressed at home. So, what's the mitzvah? So the Taz, who was a good son-in-law, to a very prominent father-in-law, the Taz was the son-in-law of the Bach, and the Rabbi Yoel Circus. He wrote the Perush of the Bach. We know Hagos Bach and Rashi, but that's, you don't get the picture from there. But the Bach, which is, the other major commentary on the tour, the most important commentary being the Beis Yosef, or Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, but the other one is the Bach. The Bach was the father-in-law of the Torah. The Bach, in the beginning of Hilchos Sukkah, develops a very fascinating perspective, and that is based on the pasuk that we talked about before. The Torah says about the holiday of Sukkot, "Leman yedu doroseichem," in order that the generations should know, "Ki b'sukkos hashavtis b'nei Yisrael b'otzia osam me'eretz Mitzrayim." It's very rare, as we noted. Yom Kippur has something like Ki Yom Kippurim. That was one of the parallels I spoke of earlier. It's very rare for the Torah to give tamei mitzvos, to give an explanation why we have a certain mitzvah, to be so explicit about it. So the Bach, it's based really originally on Rabbeinu Hananel's comment, but doesn't quote it, in the beginning of Sukkah, but the Bach runs with it and develops it much, much more. The Bach suggests that even though normally mitzvos ein tzrichos kavana, meaning you don't have to have intention to fulfill the mitzvah, we paskin, if you do the mitzvah properly and you don't have intention not to fulfill the mitzvah, then it would be better if you had in mind that you're doing lishma or l'shem mitzvah. But if you didn't, the mitzvah would still be appropriate. It would still be effective, still be valid. However, says the Bach, since the Torah says here, "Leman yedu doraseichem," the Torah specifically says, in order that you should understand, when it comes to the mitzvah of Sukkah, there is an added requirement that you be purposive, that you be cognizant that you're doing the mitzvah. There are different formulations of this, or why you're doing the mitzvah, or how this fits in, with the journey of Klal Yisrael, then, and, as a paradigm for us. Imposes a greater requirement of intentionality and of consciousness, if you will, in the performance of the mitzvah. That's what the Bach says. And the Bach goes so far as to say that if you don't have in mind, when you're sitting in the sukkah, that you're doing it for this reason, maybe it won't fulfill the mitzvah. We always, in our sukkah, we always, mention this, the first night, right before Kiddush, that people should have in mind, that sitting in the sukkah is Laman Yedu Daraseichem. It's an important idea. The Taz, the son-in-law, suggests that this idea is the idea that underpins the huge chiddush of mitzvah patur min sukkah. After all, as we said before, where do we find that distress or discomfort, is sufficient to exempt you from a biblical obligation? Says the Taz, if a person is distressed and preoccupied, if he can't properly appreciate or focus on the goal of the mitzvah of sukkah, then he's not really fulfilling that mitzvah either. In other words, this mitzvah or this requirement reflects a kind of, standard. The sukkah is a victim of its own standard, if you will. You have to be there, in a conscious and contemplative and purposive way, and only if you are you properly fulfilling the mitzvah. And therefore, someone who legitimately is preoccupied by other matters, whether it's chol Hashem b'sakana or mitzdayer, he can't muster the proper attention or focus to appreciate and therefore to fulfill properly the mitzvah, then such a person is exempt from the mitzvah. And that's how he explains the Gemara of Avel. The Gemara says, a person is an Avel. It's true, if he goes in the house, he's going to be just as much in a state of Avel. He doesn't benefit from going in the house. It has nothing to do with the quality of the venue. It has nothing to do with Simcha, because he's unhappy here and he'll be unhappy there. But if he's preoccupied, if he can't extricate himself from the sense of profound, loss and sadness, based on who's not with him in the sukkah, if that's all he's focusing on, then he can't fulfill the mitzvah properly. And what the Gemara then says is, "Iboy liyisuve daite. It's unacceptable that his personal loss, right, should distract him from the purpose of the sukkah. He's obligated to muster, a level of appreciation about Simchas Yom Tov and everything that Sukkah and Sukkot in the aftermath of Yom Kippur stands for, such that he will be able to focus. And that's how the Taz reads the Gemara. So that the third and final idea is the idea that, Sukkot is such a critical mitzvah that it requires even more than other mitzvahs. And again, in the aftermath of the experience of Yom Kippur and the tshuva and everything that goes with it, in the context of appreciating, the dependence and therefore the hashgacha, the special divine providence, whether it was actual Sukkot or the, ananei hakavod, the special miracles of the midbar, but without like a deep reflection and contemplation, right, there can be no mitzvah of sukkah, or it wouldn't be the proper progression from Yom Kippur. And therefore, rather than being, just a kind of a peculiar, leniency, mitzvah patam and sukkah, both in terms of simchas Yom Tov, as well as in terms of mimicking and setting a standard for teishvu ke'in taduru. And then finally, as an expression of, fully immersing oneself in the goal and the purpose and the spirit of the sukkah. The manyedu dorasechem kibesukos hashavtis b'nei Yisrael b'otzios sam eretz Mitzrayim. It's a kula. It is. I mean, we're not in the sukkah. There's also geshem, which I think is even more. But in both cases, these are leniencies, but they're leniencies that are an outgrowth of the tremendous aspiration that we have for this mitzvah and the outsized role that it plays, b'chodesh hashvi hazeh, in the aftermath of it as the natural continuation and the background of Yom Kippur, to the transition of Sukkot. So I want to wish everybody a Gemar Tov and to enjoy the last days. Hopefully we'll get the rain behind us so that not only can the Yankees play, but more importantly, we can get back to the Sukkah itself.
What's the difference?
Good yard. Thank you so much, Rabbi Rosensweig.
No,